Hi, Brian.
Oh, hey, Ram. All right.
Hi. 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 How are you? Hi. Nice to see you.
I briefly would like to introduce Rem and Ken. It's, I think, a historical event, and it's not something I discovered only this morning when I was reading again all the things, all the articles and books Ken Frampton was writing, and then I discovered, and that's why I was checking, that he was not writing that much about Rem. So probably tonight we hear a lot more about that. I'm very happy to have this conversation between Rem and Ken, and I think it was for me already a question why Rem, who was choosing people he would like to talk to have a dialogue with, and I think it's interesting that he mentioned Ken as one of the first, and I think they will talk about let's say the role of the critic, but that's something I would leave to them. Hopefully tonight we get to know a lot more. I think the format for a conversation is much more interesting than the monologue where Rem or Ken would present themselves. So in this sense, I'm quite happy with this format. I think it all happened a couple of months ago when I was riding with Rem in a car and we discussed a format to have more, let's say, discussion within the institute. And he came with the idea to have some meetings, and I'm very happy that it happened today. Rem will explain the way he would like to see this happening. So the word is yours.
Good afternoon. As was just mentioned, I was invited a couple of months ago to make a contribution to the school or to have an intervention in the school, and I thought it was appropriate to suggest that instead of presenting some kind of point of view myself, or to present work myself, to pose within the context of the school a number of questions to a number of people that I have wanted to pose for a very long time, but that somehow because of the definitions of our respective roles in architectural culture, you almost never get a sense, an opportunity to pose. In other words, as an architect, it is very important to communicate with critics, or that seems evident. Nevertheless, it is very rare that the kind of directness which is here occurring at the table of a direct meeting between the critic and the architect ever occurs. And most of the communication takes place via the printed word, and we all know what that means in terms of distortions and simplifications. So what I thought was interesting to present maybe a series of a number of conversations with people that I think have defined in a critical way the architectural condition at this moment. And it may not be immediately evident to everyone in the room that the people I've kind of suggested have had this role. But as the first one in this series, I've wanted to talk to Kenneth Frampton for the simple reason that I think he is, in a certain way, the only critic, maybe the only critic left, maybe he's the last critic. There is certainly something apocalyptic about his entire status, and I think we have to talk about that apocalyptic aura that Kenneth has carried so well and that has carried him so far. The other conversations will be with, hopefully with Colin Rowe, although he hasn't agreed to meet me yet, with Robert Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown, and hopefully also with Peter Smithen. So that's a kind of block of 4 seemingly unrelated people who are probably extremely surprised to find themselves in a single sequence, but who have the kind of only in common, in my view, that they have made important interventions in the state of architecture today, and that therefore they can clarify the situation that we are in today. So that is the introduction. The format of the evening is a conversation initially between Kenneth and myself, and we will see at some point whether the conversation that we have will also charge or provoke questions in others, so that at some point we will try to open it up to the public at large. But initially it is a response about a number of people, about the 2 of us to begin with. I should maybe explain something about also your career, because I don't assume that it's universally known, and especially there are 2. Kenneth was an architect, and I think that's not an important part of the whole persona, although it is never very explicit maybe. He is an architect born in 1930 in England. He became an architect, I think, in the early 50s, was active as an architect in London in the early 60s, moved importantly to America in 67, and at that point also became a critic, I guess. As a critic, he has made 2 very important books. The first one is called Modern Architecture, and it's a critical history of modern architecture. That's the real title. And I think the title is maybe not entirely appropriate, because like every history, maybe, but in this case particularly, it is also very strongly a polemic. And what is interesting in Kenneth's writing is that in the beginning of the modern architecture history, there is a clear aura of objectivity, but as the book rushes to its conclusion, the polemical part is getting clearer. And the the second important book that he has written, and that's a book of more recent nature, published last year, I believe, and that 2 years ago, and that is why it also hasn't received an update yet, as the modern architecture has, Studies in Tectonic Culture. So I would say that the one is a history of a number of movements in modern architecture, and I would say that the second is maybe a kind of zoom or an analysis of a particular aspect of architecture, namely the production of architectural detail and the role detail plays in architectural representation. But I would say that it's not exaggerated to say that your reputation is based mostly on these 2 books, plus of course an endless number of articles, and of course a presence, international presence in terms of lectures, teaching, etc. But maybe now I should kind of really start. Basically, if you have an interview, I remember from the time that I was a journalist, it is important to pose the important questions last and to start with innocent questions. And I wanted to reverse that now. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the role of a critic?
Well, I had some warning for that one, but
what does a critic do?
Yes, right. I mean, actually, I'm very happy to be sort of identified as a critic, because sometimes I think that I don't do a very good job in that regard, and I think that the most difficult thing about being a critic, or among the difficult things about being a critic, is one, of course, perception and capacity to evaluate work generously but also rigorously. I mean, I think it's mostly that's important, but even more important is the fact, of course, to have the courage to actually adopt a position, in fact, in relation to contemporary work. And that, for me, brings up an issue that I was thinking about, that maybe because of this conversation the last 2 days or so, is the way in which I think an unfortunate aspect of contemporary architectural culture, and you could say maybe it was true of all architectural culture, since architects are, almost, if they're good architects, almost of necessity self-involved and single-minded. But I think that the unfortunate effect of media, though, in relation to that, is that somehow or other, once the figure is established, there is somehow the tacit assumption, which gets also supported by consensus, that every project thereafter by this particular figure has to be as good as every other project. There's a sort of uneven demand made by the media that once the hero is established, the work has to always be up to that level. And I think that's a really one of the negative effects of the media. I mean, I suppose I've digressed slightly from this question of what is the function of the critic, but maybe it goes back to this question of courage, the courage to which is difficult to have, I think, courage plus the perception, to say that that is a great work, and or to come behind a certain work by a certain architect, and also later to not follow the architect because you don't believe the work is up to the same level. I mean, of course, the negative part is the part that needs more courage and the more difficult thing, and also it needs to be properly formulated. I mean, there are.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
So you think that the first role of the architect of the critic is to make judgments about the quality of architectural works?
Well, only in the sense of elaborating the discourse through these judgments. I mean, just simply to say, well, this is good or this is bad, of course, is obviously not of any interest. But to somehow articulate, what it is you think is of quality and why it is of quality and why it is of relevance, for example, at a particular moment, at a particular time. And also sometimes to depart from consensus. I mean, I will give you an example. An architect I admire very much is Alvaro Siza. I think it is true that Siza is of this opinion as well, and also many figures around him, that Bonjour Tristesse is an important building by him in Berlin. And it is certainly on the cover of one of the monographs that by which it's a judgment I can't comprehend at all. I think Bonjour Tristesse is one of the most uninteresting buildings he ever did. I mean, I've never said that in public. This comes bringing me back to the courage issue. It may be unnecessary to say it, of course, but it's that kind of, I think that kind of role that one should, ideally one should be able to live with, to adopt, to carry through.
But I think that we're living in the 20th century, and I think that modern architects, which is the period of modern architecture, and I think that modern architects have been both spoiled in every sense of the word by the presence of critics that were, let's say, more than critics or maybe less than critics, but critics that were also propagandists for architects and that were able to create for a particular architect a kind of architectural space in which they could perform their tasks. And I think that kind of part of the broken relationship, I would say, between architects and critics, or tense relationship between architects and critics, is this condition today that there is an expectation on the part of architects that the critic is not only the one who judges whether a particular work is not good, strong or not strong, but that also exposes for him a direction in which he could go, defends for him certain rights, intervenes, in other words, in a very almost cultural sense in the creation of, let's say, a theoretical space, and to help the architect to defend the theoretical space. And I'm thinking, of course, of architects like Sigrid Gideon, who had, in that sense, a kind of very important role as not only a historian, not only a critic, but somebody who was able to march in parallel with and actually create these potentials for the architect. And I think that's a kind of very important creative role of the critic, which is perhaps separate from the role strictly of judgment. And I'm kind of wondering, of course, what your kind of role for the critic is.
Well, I'm not sure it can be completely separated out from judgment, but it seems to me, and I have already encountered that, of course, that although this is already a kind of moment that is past, you know, but at some point, well, certainly when modern architecture and critical history first appeared, despite the fact that I had a kind of, if you like, endorsement from Tafuri, you know. From the circle of Tafuri, of course, my position was seen as operative criticism, and therefore, of course, a no-no, you know, because it wasn't distant enough, basically. It wasn't distant enough from the contemporary production, basically, you know. And as you said yourself, you know, as the book moves towards its end, you know, it becomes increasingly polemical, which you could say is almost inevitable. But I mean, you know, that's how it is. I can't deny that. I mean, I think you know, I can't separate myself from this position quite. You know, I don't think I have that much distance. But on the other hand, I think I am able to. I mean, if I may, it's an unfair comparison. But if I compare my role to, for instance, the role that Vincent Scully played in relation to Robert Venturi, I don't think I've ever quite played that role. You know, in which, you know, he comes out and says, you know, that. Complexity and Contradiction is the most important book since Towards New Architecture. You know, in that kind of selling of an architect, I mean, I don't think I've ever...
Yeah, but it may not always be selling. It may be also a kind of sign that the critic has an agenda, and that that it's a kind of reversal of the kind of maybe the relationships of power, that the critic has an idea first, and that then the architect follows. And I think that one of the things that has always struck me about you is that I should maybe declare that by some bizarre coincidence, Kenneth Frampton and myself met each other in 1970 somewhere in a museum in the Netherlands, and that we know each other almost 30 years by pure coincidence. But that for somebody who is clearly possessed with your enthusiasm for architecture, that nevertheless, if you read your declarations, and that is where kind of some of the apocalyptic part kind of maybe comes in, there is a recurrent streak of discouragement. And I think that the discouragement is kind of not that there is a particular negativity about an individual architect, but that you kind of pose the condition of architecture in a way that almost seems to make it hopeless to perform as an architect. And I want to kind of read one of your typical diagnoses of the current condition. And that you were just talking about the media in a way, kind of reinforcing a caricature of the effect of media and a stereotype of the effect of media, to which I think occasionally you yourself contribute. Yeah. For instance, this is your diagnosis of the current condition of the architect. the tendency, now more prevalent than ever, to select architects on the basis of their notoriety, or what one might call their marketability, rather than for the intrinsic quality of their work. Such a superficial choice invariably leads to disheartening results. I mean, I think that's one of your the ways you describe current, let's say the crudeness of current architectural culture. And I mean, in the books I read, there is a kind of endless accumulation of those kind of things that don't seem to be so much a kind of analysis of the situation, but more for your own part, a kind of incantation of the present. This is the present kind of somehow is bad, and this is the condition I live with. And in that sense, what seems to be, for me, what was striking me with incredible force is the contradiction between an obsessive interest in architecture, an obsessive love for architecture, but at the same time an obsessive gloom about architecture. How do you...
Well, but you know, it's possible to read you and come to the same, exactly the same conclusion. I mean, we are too alike in that regard, I think.
Yeah, well, I forgot to mention that we share the same star sign.
I think, and you are the same. I think I think it's good to tell oneself terrifying stories, and because it keeps you on edge, and this edge is productive.
Yes, but
rather than the always for the best in the best of all possible worlds kind of approach to the situation.
Of course not. But I don't think we are the same, because we have one very important difference is that we have different professions, and I think that kind of really colors makes the difference, kind of profound difference, because there is a difference between a pessimistic critic and a pessimistic architect.
I don't know how to go from that point. I mean, I like to think that this kind of negativity always has built into it a sort of, I like the ending of Alain René's Providence, when John Gielgud wakes up from a terrible night and his children come because it's his birthday, and at this, I love these words, because he says, when they sort of congratulate him, he says, after they have indulged in rather negative prognostications, not for architecture but for the world in general, he says, but we know that nothing is written, surely we all believe that, you know. But it seems to me that it ought to be possible to, as it were, continue in the face of the recognition of the negative. I mean, this.
Of course, my question was not about your necessarily you as a critic, but about the role of a critic. And the question was, and maybe I didn't kind of really formulate it clearly enough, do you think the critic also has a role to create space for architecture to occur? Or is his role to kind of identify really to what extent a profession or domain as architecture is encroached from all times, and as he does it with greater or lesser virtuosity, kind of finally creating an impression that there is almost no exit from this encroachment coming from all directions?
Well, I mean, a direct answer to that is I think that the critic should create space for architecture to continue, for culture to continue. Mm-hmm. I mean, for architecture to continue in a way as a critical culture, I think that is what I feel a critic should do, you know.
Okay, maybe we should stay on the word critical for a while.
Yes,
yeah?
right. Yeah.
Because I think your main contribution and your main achievement, but maybe that's not your opinion, as a theorist of criticism, is the theory of critical regionalism.
Yes.
Would you say that that's right?
Yes, yes, yes.
And there is one definition of it that I will kind of read here. And the word critical regionalism, a cynic would wonder whether you choose the combination of two words innocently, or whether you play with the notion of contradiction in terms. The critical regionalism is described by Ken. The strength of provincial culture resides in its capacity to condense the artistic and cultural potential of the region, while assimilating and reinterpreting outside influences. I think the notion is that globalization has been such an incredibly universalizing and erasing activity, an activity that on one hand in extremely short number of years has kind of engulfed the entire globe in a more or less homogeneous culture. But that within that homogeneity there are a number of kind of holdouts or specific almost valley cultures where this universality is resisted and where there is still room for the specific, the unique, the exceptional, and that somehow by exploiting that condition of provincialism and its capacity to hold on to certain traditional values and qualities, that can then be a kind of prism with which the kind of universal tendencies are refracted. Yeah, that would be okay. Yeah, okay. And in the book, you yourself, would you say that Holland is such a region?
Yeah, well, I think that this regional potential, I mean, the idea of region can also be metaphoric to some extent. I mean, this idea of regional potential perhaps exists in a lot of places. I mean, and then you have this dialectic between that regional potential and the globalization. And in many ways, of course, globalization can be seen as Americanization. And this is, I think a definite issue in the Netherlands, for example, the presence of Americanization. Perhaps, I mean, certainly Americanization is everywhere, but I think that it has played a particular kind of.
But can you be specific then?
Well, I mean. There is a kind of very tough Dutch tradition, I think, which one could say is embedded in figures like Dijker, for example, which perhaps still is part of the Dutch modern tradition. I mean, I know you once gave a provocative lecture with the title "Is Dutch Architecture Really Modern?" And that tradition can be set against, for example, the seductions of dirty realism, in as much as dirty realism is something that is, at least can be seen as emanating from a kind of confrontation with American reality, and can be seen as part of a kind of unavoidable globalization and Americanization of the world, and that it's necessary to come to terms with this reality,
Let's try to for instance, test your theory. And see whether, if you take it seriously, you could construct a position on the basis of Dutchness. Because you would say, for instance, that there is a Dutch kind of architectural tradition that has certain values and that has a kind of inherent consistency. And I would say that 99.99% of Dutch architects maintains those values triumphantly. So there must be other elements of kind of the Dutch region that that could construct a kind of typically Dutch position. I'm just trying to see how the theory might work. And then let's say one of our Dutch traditions has been a kind of fetishization of the commercial since the 17th century. and a kind of surrender to outside forces, and the kind of fluidity of flows of goods and imports and exports. That's another kind of very Dutch.
But I mean, one part of Dutch culture, it seems to me, in terms of building culture and in terms of the relationship between building and agriculture, for example, is an incredible kind of artificial precision, which has been, sustained for a very long time in the Netherlands, it seems to me, and a sort of linear, almost engraved position, with regard to the way landscape is handled, water is handled, buildings are handled, etc., etc. And I even think whenever I come, from Schiphol, for example, that the whole road network passing from Schiphol, into the center of Amsterdam is okay. It's universal. It's global. But there is something about the way the road network has been engineered and the way in which it is used, I think, is also incredibly precise compared to comparable American road systems. What exactly that is not so easy to say. Some of it has got to do with the kind of industrial design elements that accompany that, I think. But maybe also just simply a certain added refinement to the engineering capacity of Dutch road engineers versus American road engineers. I mean, I think that we don't know enough, by the way, about. On the one hand, we assume technology is universal, and yet from time to time one can notice that, people who are not architects, engineers, have a way of doing things in one country as opposed to another, including even the manufacture of material.
But is that part of an unconscious, or is it a kind of operational method?
Well,
because can we begin to pursue it? Is our added precision a gift, or is it a talent, or is it genius, or is it?
No, it's something that has been.
And do you still see that kind of added precision in our current architecture?
Well, I think it's threatened in the current American current architecture in the Netherlands. I think it is threatened. This value is threatened, I think. But I mean, how does it get to be there? Not in the genes, but is deposited culturally, historically, subliminally almost, in the capacity of the industry or of the society to do things in a certain way, And that it seems to me is potentially sitting there always as a strength, which should be, as it were, reinterpreted or built upon for what, this is not sufficient to carry the whole idea, but it's something that is always lying there and should be respected or cultivated in a way, is what I'm trying to say, I think.
I wanted to, in a kind of earlier quotation I made, I wanted to come back to this regionalism issue, because in the definition of critical regionalism, you quote an American whose name I didn't know, Harville Hamilton Harris.
Yes.
And he spoke about two kinds of regionalism. The first is called restricted, and the second is called liberated. And what he writes is the manifestation of a region that is especially in tune with the emerging thought of the time. Regional, only because it has not yet emerged elsewhere. To express this regionalism architecturally, it is necessary that there be building, preferably a lot of building. And I think that there, you yourself put your finger on two streaks in kind of regionalism. And I think that when you talk about the kind of the Dutch regionalism that you, in the way you just did, it's kind of cast in terms of its past. And I think that the regionalism, the liberated regionalism that is kind of suggested here by Harris is another one, which is regionalism as being the kind of unique movement that occurs when certain phenomena that are eventually bound to occur elsewhere, and maybe in the current culture everywhere, where they appear for the first time. In other words, there is a kind of notion that phenomena cannot emerge everywhere because they have a kind of pertinence, maybe, or a uniqueness in the beginning. So in that sense, that is for me a kind of much more interesting regionalism, namely because it is about kind of new phenomena that occur, and that moment of newness can maybe have a term regional. And I think that there it becomes interesting to explore what could at this moment be those kind of regionalisms. And for instance, I know a number of them where, for instance, the uniqueness, the intensity, the proliferation of building are all present, but where I would nevertheless be very certain that you would be kind of horrified to call such a region part of a critical regionalism.
Yeah.
For instance, I'm talking about Asia, where kind of very clearly there are right now a kind of production of cities at such incredible speed that I'm firmly convinced kind of mutant conditions of city are being generated. And I'm also convinced that those kind of mutant conditions will have an important repercussions for the whole status of the city or the condition of the city. And within this context you can read it as a kind of form of regionalism, namely at those points where the eruption first occurred.
Well, actually, the whole provocation makes me think of lots of things. And actually, this summer also, I was for 10 days in China, so I went to Xi'an, Shanghai, Beijing, etc. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that I was somewhat traumatized by that trip. And I know, of course, your piece on generic city, and then I read more recently Singapore songlines, for example. And so I think although I think you've experienced more of it than I have, so that you've had your face put in it, so to speak, much more directly than I have, or many of us have, for that matter. And what one says in the face of it, and I think generic city is very much about that, as a matter of fact, because I think the text constantly oscillates between a belief that somehow or other this energy can be tapped, and then in the next sentence, of course, a recognition of its intractability, so to speak, and a kind of oscillating enthusiasm and anger with yourself as you run through the thing, ending with this unbelievable parable of the film at the end of the generic city, which I find rather astonishing. I mean, positively astonishing. This film run backwards. We can go, the theatre, the show is over. Vis-a-vis the city, the story of the city. So, all right. I mean, this question of, there's a big jump historically between California in the 20s and early 30s, which is what Hamilton Harris is talking about. Up to, in fact, one can trace, I think, the Southern California School from 1912 as a continuous, by the way, tradition, full of energy in a way, even if limited to domestic production mainly, right through to the 50s, really, even just the early 60s, to John Intense's case study houses, etc., etc. It's a continuous, very rich trajectory, I think, which makes Los Angeles, I think, one of the most amazing repositories of domestic modern architecture in the world, really. And there, of course, you touch immediately upon clients, which is that this is still true, I think, compared to the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, is that you're more likely to find in the West Coast of the United States a middle-class client who wants something from an architect, has a desire, versus the East Coast. And of course, even then, Harris is making this contrast between East and West Coast, and he's really he doesn't use the word provincialism, but he's implying, that the whole Museum of Modern Art, with its kind of domination by European high modernism, was somehow rather trapped into the, neo-Bauhaus kind of rigidity, and as opposed to the vitality of California's reinterpretation of of the modern movement, filtered through Gill, Wright, and then of course Neutral, Schindler, and so on. And then the clients for those architects were critically important, so that I think when one talks about regional culture and architecture in relation to regional culture, one always has to bear in mind this question of the clients, you know, and the kind of education of a client, the cultivation of a client. You know.
Okay, but let's look at that then.
Yes.
So how do you, so it is clear that in China clients are not that educated, that they don't have a kind of museum of modern art, that they haven't had architects like Franklin Wright, certainly not modern architects, who have been able to kind of propose that kind of sequential series of developments. Step by step, so to speak. So, in other words, you could even say that there was no architectural culture. And nevertheless, in a certain urban region, there is a necessity to go from 12 million to 34 million in 20 years. I mean, what would your critical proposal be in such a condition? Because at the same time you see that the kind of regionalism is also destroyed or kind of eroded because there is no local culture anymore. Maybe not because of Americanization, but something that might as well be called Chinese education or whatever other, or Chineseness or whatever word you use.
Well,
I
don't know. No, I think it's a very. These are really very pertinent questions, and I think not so easy to understand or to take a position towards even, but you know, in a way, you know, you yourself say somewhere in the big book, you know, that architecture is a culture of the elite. I think you say somewhere, you know, and it could, of course, be formulated differently. It could be formulated as a kind of middle class culture, in fact, you know, as you know, inseparable from the triumph of bourgeoisie and the bourgeois Enlightenment to some extent. You know, and one could also say that democracy, for example, is also dependent upon this educated middle class project. You know, what has happened in the Chinese case is maybe a little bit difficult to understand, but I think, you know, one of the things one could say is that this middle class never really, you know, never really had a chance to come into existence. On the scale that it has been a long-standing part of, let's say, Dutch culture, for example, or English culture, or for American for that matter, you know, where, you know,
but it's actually coming into place with kind of amazing speed, but well, at the same time with all the kind of illiteracy or kind of barbaric energy that kind of implies, but nevertheless, you know, are you kind of really then saying that kind of from your critical position? A kind of problem like that is intractable, or kind of is doomed to remain a kind of non-architectural zone, or that kind of a number of kind of good architectural elements will make a kind of a small but significant difference. What is your? I'm kind of really interested in your position, because I think on the one hand, your diagnosis is very abstract. And I think that it is nevertheless kind of interesting to see how, as a critic, you define those areas as architectural territories.
Yeah, I think it's hard to understand, I think, what is really happening in the Chinese situation, but it seems to me, and it's not just the Chinese situation. I mean, if you think of someone like Bill Gates, for example, which has, what, 14 billion, we don't know how many billion anymore this man has, you know, and you compare Bill Gates and this generation of enormous wealth in the United States to the Carnegies and to the Rockefellers and to the Goulds, the robber barons in Matthew Josephson's book, you know, who established universities and the museums and all these government institutions in post-Civil War United States, you know. These people, of course, were robber barons and wanted to make money, but they had a vision of what they, however naively or romantically, they had a vision of what kind of society they would like to try to create. I mean, they thought they could, and indeed they, to some extent, did succeed in achieving in the United States cultural kind of institutions that equaled those of Europe and even surpassed those of Europe, you know. If we now come to the power in the sense of money today, capitalist power today in the United States, what do these people want? What kind of vision of society do they have? Do they have any vision of the American society? Big question. And I think that the influence of that upon China, for example, is there is only one rule: make as much money as possible. We don't have any other vision. Just get rich. You know, this is the only vision we have. You know, all the rest is romanticism. You know, who cares? You know, this. I mean, the Chinese will tear up anything.
Sorry, no. Well, I think this is kind of really the where we get to kind of really to grips and to a kind of crucial point of your kind of critical activity, because I think that if you declare that there is no vision in Bill Gates, then obviously.
But he isn't alone.
Obviously, you're kind of short-circuiting kind of like an amazing discussion, because this is the person who disseminated the kind of Windows. This is the man who made the kind of internet infinitely accessible. This is the man who is importing and kind of extending an enormous network of infinite accessibility all over the world, which, for instance, allows the Chinese to telescope educations that have taken us maybe decades to kind of accumulate in a relatively short and compact periods. So I think that there is a kind of obsession in kind of some of your writing about the kind of and a kind of almost ritualistic insistence on the kind of evil of capitalism, which is kind of perfectly true probably on one hand, but I mean to deny Gates a kind of vision, I think is not cultural either. And I think it's kind of really a confrontation of you know, two different kind of interpretations of culture, and where one of them, and you're kind of yourself quoting these cultures that are kind of about visual, crafted culture, kind of built culture, etc., and kind of resistance to admit the other current and kind of probably less tangible, less tactile, and therefore certainly not providing a number of kind of pleasures, but you're denying it kind of a status.
Yes, well, you know, I mean, you could.
Why? And why?
Well, you could make the argument, and I sometimes think that it's the case that, you know, there is something sort of essentially quixotic about architecture, you know, and even you can say, from the point of view of the kind of world you've been describing, totally anachronistic. Because, all right, you need buildings. I mean, you know, buildings can be provided, but maybe these buildings are not architecture. You know, they are also perhaps disposable shelters that simply, you know, strategically handle the operation. I mean, I just saw, and I should have bought it, a recent book by Manuel Castells, Information City. And there he makes an argument, which is basically, I haven't read the complete argument, but he plays with words. But he says, you know, we are ending the welfare period, we're ending the warfare period, you know, in terms of the future socioeconomic new age situation, you know. Welfare's over, warfare, you know. This is Manuel Castells, left-wing French intellectual, but, you know, etc. You know, and this may well be the case. I mean, you're surely right that, you know, the cybernetic capacity, information, the speed of light, and so on and so forth, and money moving at the speed of light enables, you know, the Chinese to, as you say, develop, you know, for a larger number of people, for an enormous number of people. You know, we cannot predict the future. That's true. You know, you could say that, and the person with whom I share my life with constantly says to me, you know, in moments that we discuss things like this, well, it will not be solved in our lifetime. You know, I mean, you know, these things will take a long time. And perhaps at some point in, I don't know, 20 years, 50 years, the situation in China will be different. But the problem of today is that the speed of development is such that one wonders whether, you know, and now we're off the subject of architecture altogether, whether, you know, this species, this talking animal, will have a capacity to modulate what this talking animal is able to produce and distribute and so on.
But I think it's also possible, of course, that you define architecture in terms that by definition are doomed to kind of fail in a kind of or to be irrelevant in a kind of a vast number of conditions in favor of a description that kind of works in only kind of very rare cases. And this is where I think that my initial question whether the role of a critic is to kind of limit or to kind of create a space and to define a space that can be filled becomes critical. I wanted to read you one other quotation from your book, again not by you, but in this case by Bergotti, an Italian architect that you admire. And it goes, before transforming a support into a column, a roof into tympanum, before placing stone on stone, man placed a stone on the ground to recognize a site in the midst of an unknown universe, in order to take account of it and modify it. Apart from the horrible language, which I think may be simply a case of bad translation, I'm personally it fills me with a kind of incredible surprise in a way that you would, at the end of the 20th century, still kind of insist that to place a stone on the ground to recognize a site in the midst of an unknown universe actually represent an important or valuable act. Because it is so clear that by doing that you condemn so many others to be kind of floating in the universe and to kind of remain floating forever.
I don't think I agree with you, because it's very odd that we have this argument, because I think in your own work there is this kind of tendency towards landscape as being critical. I mean, I just recently saw in London this catalogue produced by Arche on the late Yves Bounier, where there's an exchange between you and him, I think, about landscape and the importance of landscape. Of course, it's the time, I suppose, of La Villette, etc., etc. But it seems to me that, this question of landscape is also something to which you yourself gravitate. And that same quotation that you've just mentioned, makes a distinction that the origin of architecture is not the primitive hut, but the marking of ground. And it seems to me that this question, which brings us back maybe to the Dutch tradition also, of marking of ground, is important from the point of view of being able to mediate the rapacity of late modern development. I mean, if I think to myself, what can ever redeem, the American strip and the endless kind of consumption of land driven by, of course, the automobile and speculation, which talking of apocalyptic figures, Leo Marx is perpetually obsessed with, and I think with good reason, is the only thing that will ever possibly redeem this, in a sense, making it other than just detritus, which you also recognize that it is some kind of landscape operation that will sort of anchor this stuff in some way or other. So I think from this point of view, you say condemn these people to floating. I think, that why is this not a responsibility? I mean, is not landscape
but I think
of the utmost importance?
I think that kind of all your arguments are kind of perfectly valid if we eliminate from the equation the issue of numbers. In other words, it is true, of course, that everyone has a kind of right, and that it's significant to anchor, and that kind of probably it will contribute to happiness. But even you can imagine to anchor one person, you can imagine anchoring two persons, but can you still imagine anchoring 10,000 people, or can you imagine anchoring millions? And I think that was another interesting effect of kind of reading all your work in the space of 2 weeks, that emanated from it. There was almost an anti-urban sense that can maybe you're a theoretician and a critic who has defined the field of architecture to the extent that it is not the field of urbanism, or to the extent it doesn't kind of engage the numbers of urbanism, or to the extent that it isn't kind of accepting or part of the proliferation of the urban condition as we know it.
Well, I have two responses. One is, of course, I think you're right that this neglect of urbanism is problematic.
No, it's not a neglect. I think it's really a rejection of. I think.
Well, neglect or rejection. I mean, it's an avoidance, perhaps. You know, avoidance. But nevertheless, I think it's a really valid issue, and that. It's something that begins to preoccupy me more and more, this question of what kind of effective strategies can be adopted in relation to the proliferation of a universal megalopolis. You know. But I noticed that in Singapore songlines at the beginning, I think, you know, actually it's interesting, I think the appraisals you give to the Japanese, you know, both to Maki on the one hand and Tanguy on the other. And when you recognize that Tokyo Bay, for example, is a kind of, you don't actually say it, but it seems to me, you know, that you give that project a lot of value. And it seems to me that project has, apart from its bigness and scale, etc., and dealing with the greatest number, it also has a strongly landscape dimension to it. You know, it's strongly topographic project, really. And so, you know, the criticism you made may well be valid. I mean, I would accept it. But I think that choosing what can be effective strategies, you know, and even delimiting them in order to make them more effective, is perhaps, you know, maybe one of the real options one has left as an architect, or if you like, urbanist, in relation to the predicament of this rate of development and production. You know, I mean, you yourself, by implication or directly, draw enormous distinctions between the Tanguy project, for example, and what happened in Singapore, and the efforts by Lim, you know, to this publication of Spur. You use this play Spur spurned, you know, as far as the power is concerned, you know.
But I think that the spurned, Spur spurned, to explain, there was a Singapore movement of architects called Spur. I don't even know what it stands for.
Urban is in there somewhere, but
and probably renovation. And they were kind of largely spurned, but I think that had exactly to do, in kind of my view, with with this mode of resistance and kind of with this mode of delimitation. But I want to.
But whose resistance? I mean, their resistance, you mean?
Well, their resistance against, or trying to kind of resist against the flow of the kind of Singapore government in terms of its uprooting and acceleration.
But they. I mean, when you also illustrate the project they did, you cannot really say that project is. In fact, you were rather disappointed in it architecturally, but you cannot really say that it is ipso facto, you know, completely categorically opposite to what the government wants to do.
But I wanted to kind of come back to an earlier question or an earlier quote I read about the kind of star system, etc. And again something about the role of the critic and the relationship between the critic and the kind of field of architecture. Because I think your contempt for the architectural star system is clear. What you probably realize is that it's kind of not a unique contempt, but that it's a contempt kind of probably shared by everyone in this room. And that it's probably also a contempt shared by many of the architects who are part and incorporated, or not to say imprisoned in the star system. And I think that, you know, when you read a kind of fairly denigrating description like that, I want to kind of read it again, because I think it's...
You found the best pieces.
No, I didn't. It's nothing to do with the best pieces, but anyway, if you, for instance, put the name of, let's say, Frank Gehry or Peter Eisenman in place of the star. In other words, if you, in the kind of typical Framptonian way, kind of replace generality with specificity, then I wonder what you get. Yeah, the tendency now more prevalent than ever to select architects on the basis of their notoriety or what one might call their marketability rather than... So let's talk about, for instance, Bilbao, or let's talk about Peter Eisenman in Cincinnati. I think that they're clearly stars. They were kind of probably selected for the wrong reasons. They probably are highly involved in all kinds of extraneous to architecture kind of reasons. Maybe marketability is one of them. But would you say that they... Well, what has kind of surprised me many times is that your coldness to that kind of work, and your and this comes again back to the role of the architect, the role of the critic, and the kind of relationship between the critic and the architect, and implicitly whether there are questions of support or lack of support, and whether lack of support actually implies undermining. But I think that both Gehry and Eisenman, in spite of their ludicrous fame, are also very seriously dealing, for instance, with the notion of putting a stone, if you want to put it that way, like anchoring on a specific place, a specific culture, and a specific...
Yeah, although we can't simply reduce architecture to that alone, you know.
No, okay, but I mean, but anyway, it seems to deny the potential kind of seriousness of, you know, what people like them, like they are do and what they're involved with, and also the seriousness of their enterprise. And I think that you, as a critic, in a way, could ought to recognize seriousness whenever you encounter it.
I mean, this also comes back to this question of courage, I think, you know, and also whether it is what is appropriate, you know. I mean, in the main, I don't make many references. I do make some to Gehry and to Eisenman, you know, and of course they are aware of that, and I have my reasons, well, and maybe this is a bit too personal, but if I were to sort of contrast their production to your own, for example, it seems to me that that your own production is always, in one way or another, committed to the idea of the program and to the form of the building, but the form of the building in relation to the articulation of the micro space of which the building is made up. You know, I mean, one can make criticism, but I think that that is a key aspect of your own work, and in the sense, unfinished modern project, to coin the phrase of Habermas, you know, in relation, remains still a kind of anchor, I think, in your own production. For reasons which are not so easy to explain, and maybe also involve me in a certain, let's say, perpetual misunderstanding, it seems to me that the problem with the work of Frank Gehry, and particularly the later work of Frank Gehry as opposed to Edgemar or Santa Monica Place, is that it's not good enough to be an architect. You have to be an artist, you know. So I find that unacceptable position. I mean, I think that...
Where does Gehry state that?
He doesn't state it, but the work is evident. The work is gigantic figurative pieces of sculpture. Bilbao is a huge piece of sculpture. In my opinion, it is not really fundamentally, deeply responsible architectural work in that it is not articulated in terms of the program. You know, art, like, you know, the art gallery doesn't have a program, therefore I can do what the hell I like. You know, I just don't accept this as a position. So therefore, you know, and Peter, who is much more intellectual.
But aren't you kind of reading like and aren't you kind of accepting the public stereotype and therefore the public caricature and taking that as a kind of enemy? Because I think that, for instance, Gehry is like the kind of simulation of a kind of somebody who's boasting about his artistry and taking his artistry as a kind of final and ultimate kind of reason for his whole production is manifestly, you know, inaccurate. If you, I could contrast it, for instance, to an experience only 4 weeks ago of the typical architect, and this is the same person groveling in front of the city building services in order to get with infinite difficulty, you know, permission for a kind of very strong kind of public improvement, etc., etc. I find there is something, you know, just as the kind of task of the critic should not be kind of caricatured. I think that the intensity and let's say the critique to the or on the external appearance of the stars, I think weakens your entire case in the sense that you deny kind of any value or integrity or kind of any other depth to them, and to some extent turns it into a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, but I mean, you're a critic. Life is short. I mean, somebody, one has to make one's choices. You know, I mean, I try not to. I mean, of course, this is on record, so you know, I've done it again. But I mean, basically, I should not talk about Frank Gehry. You know, I mean, if I don't feel I can treat the subject with adequate generosity, you know. But on the other hand, I realize how, there's nothing that succeeds like success, right? You know, I mean, a building or a person becomes it in the media system, and then, you know, everybody goes overboard. And all critical judgment gets completely suspended. Not all, but you know how the, I don't know, from Bob Hughes to God knows who, it's just, get into a state of euphoria, you know, where there are many architects in the world after all. You know, all right.
Nevertheless, I think that the state of euphoria, I think that since you're not external to the culture of architecture, I think that kind of using the external image of architecture to critique in a way the internal condition of architecture is ambiguous.
No, but that
because the state of euphoria, we all know that it doesn't exist kind of inside the architecture.
Well, that's
community.
not quite true, Rem, because I think that external critique also affects, a judgment inside the discourse of architecture itself, because of the power of the media and the kind of I don't know, this euphoria that, you know, this is the triumph, one of the sort of masterpieces at the end of the 20th century. Anyway, this starts to affect judgment, I think, inside architectural schools, inside. Yeah, it's not as though it is sort of, that the internal discourse is immune to the power of that opinion. I don't think it is. Do you think it is?
No, it's not immune, but I think.
Sorry.
But I think it's at the same time. Well, anyway, are there any questions? No, since you were kind of since you referred to the kind of architectural community in the schools, are there any questions in, let's say, in the first ranges of that would be kind of an interesting extension or deepening or kind of other sound in this discussion? Yeah, you have something?
The question is to whom to ask the question. Again, I would like to maybe when you introduce Ken also as an architect, to start as an architect, maybe you could mention that he a couple of months ago finished his own house. So maybe in that sense, it will be interesting to enter a discussion on that position. Maybe not only the position of the critic, but also the position of the one who has to emphasize his position in that sense. So maybe could it be?
Do you want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, I was thinking about what I would say. I mean, first of all, this house was designed and really put on paper by Henry Smith Miller and Laurie Hawkinson, so it isn't quite true. And certainly I had some input, and Sylvia Koolhaas had input in the design of the house. So, I just want to correct that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but in terms of the kind of public, do you have a question, maybe?
Ren,
Yeah.
can I suggest that you repeat the question before you answer it? I'm sure people are about to come here.
That I repeat the question.
When somebody asks a question, you repeat.
There's no.
Okay.
There's no microphone.
The question here was the suggestion that Kenneth had just finished the house recently, and therefore had kind of resumed his career as an architect, as opposed to a critic, and can, with a kind of maybe a hint of disappointment, deny that.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Indeed. Yes.
And in fact, I was trying to keep of course, the most important question for last.
After all.
And that was actually also related to, and it's kind of a slightly psychological question. You could read your entire work as a kind of 30-year incantation to provide justifications for yourself of not being an architect anymore. In the sense that this the kind of, but maybe I should be also more kind of generous and.
Well, that's generous enough.
Yeah?
But is it? Have you finished?
Are there any questions here? Do you have a question?
Yeah, maybe a question about you can also. You've been speaking a lot recently about the power of the markets.
Is it? You should use this, I think, because otherwise it will be a question. No. Right. This one. Yeah.
You spoke a lot recently about the power of the markets, and every time again, as recently in engagements here, you've come back on that as one of the seems to be one of the big issues that's been bothering you, and it seems that you almost begin to imply that that's the only force, only kind of driving force that's important or that's pushing us. Today, you even started to speak about a kind of invisible hand. And I wonder, is there any other kind of invisible hand left?
Well, I guess it is for me, that question. But I mean, I suppose why I'm preoccupied with it is because it sort of surfaces, because it is also part of the late modern, late 20th century, late capitalist discourse, that somehow or other the market and market forces will resolve the problems of the society, and the society has to be disciplined in accordance with those market forces. Now, in the Netherlands, which is still, I think, a welfare state, it perhaps it's not so evident, but I think in certain countries it's kind of more evident, or there's a crisis in France right now, which is, I think, sort of testifies to that situation. And if you, I mean, one of the embarrassing, maybe this is not adequate and perhaps too anecdotic, but I mean, one of the embarrassing things about living in New York City is that when people come to New York, and architects, and they ask you, well, what has been built here recently that is of interest? You basically can't say anything is of interest whatsoever, And so, maybe when certain buildings that are now on the drawing board, such as the Taniguchi Museum of Modern Art or Raymond Abraham's Austrian Cultural Institute, if it ever gets to be built, you will have two buildings in New York City which you could at least say are comparable to the Guggenheim and the Seagram building, which were finished in '59. But since then, an enormous amount of building has been built in New York by developers, and by market forces, in fact. And culturally speaking, these buildings are of very little interest. I mean, or one can be horrified by, just the sheer scale of what is happening in China or in Singapore and so on and so forth. But at another level, it is happening, certainly in the United States, and has been happening in the United States for a very long time. And you can say, well, that's the way it is and the way it always has been. But I think that, the reason why I keep on bringing up the issue, I suppose, is that I think one needs to have this kind of consciousness, or try to develop this kind of consciousness that is aware of these forces and also of the positive and negative aspects of these forces. I mean, the ideology works in such a way that somehow or other, I think things get to be accepted as natural, and that they will organically work themselves out without any kind of critical alertness, I suppose, is why I keep on this incantatory reference to the market.
How is the role of cultural identity?
Pardon?
Cultural identity. You spoke also about culture recently. How does that play a role as a kind of critical framework for architects in relationship to the market, for instance?
Well, I mean, it brings one back to this question of clients, and what, how can clients be sustained? I mean, I think it's probably very difficult in the Netherlands to recognize the fact, because, I realize there's an enormous amount of building production here and an enormous amount of clients, and maybe of varying quality, but nevertheless, there is an extremely intense activity in this country with architects, basically, as far as I can see, absolutely fully employed. And in some kind of general sense, you can say there is relatively high quality in the Netherlands. But in other parts of the world, it is different. And this has strange consequences. I mean, I can give you an example. I mean, which perhaps is sort of, again, too anecdotic and perhaps not relevant. But Columbia University, for example, has a 19th century campus, basically, which has a certain particular character because of the landscape and the buildings and so on. This character is being transformed. I mean, I don't know how far they will push it, but the landscape of Columbia University campus is being transformed. Why is it being transformed, and what is it being transformed into? Being transformed into a suburban garden. Why? Because, universities are competing in the United States for undergraduates, and they have got the idea in their head that when the mothers and fathers come to the thing, they shouldn't be sort of horrified by 19th century landscape. They should be all made to feel warm and cozy, that their kids, will go to a university which looks like a suburban garden. I mean, how far they will push it, I don't know, but it definitely is on the, it's en route, so to speak. And it is a kind of cultural, I don't know what, Disneyfication of and you can say, well, so what? But I think it is, that is where, the market is sort of playing as a force on the survival of the university. Private university, of course, not subsidized by the state.
Yeah, but I think that the question is, does that make the architect powerless or not? Or is he therefore forced to accommodate and to surrender? Or are there kind of more ingenious ways, or freer, or more creative ways of reacting? And I think the whole question is that this incantation gives a kind of level of almost magic, where the kind of ultimate result seems to kind of deny the potential for a creative leap or a creative resolution or a creative confrontation with the dilemma itself.
Well,
for instance,
of course, you make me rethink about my whole production.
No.
Whether this is so or not. I mean, if one takes an architect like Tadao Ando, for example, he has worked a lot for the Japanese fashion industry and has been able to, build remarkable things for the Japanese fashion industry. Partly because of family connections, but in any case, it's the fashion industry. And that's not his exclusive client, but it has, particularly in the early part of his career, very important clientele came from the Japanese fashion industry. Which leads one to poses the kind of conundrum, how does a client base get created and how does a client base acquire its desire to support an architect to carry the job through. One of the things, whether this is true or false, I find sort of shocking is that Hermann Herzberger, for example, said to me some time ago, every time I design a new school, the budget is less. So you ask yourself, what is this Dutch society about? What's the big deal? This is a welfare state society. Why are they constantly cutting the budget for school building? What can it possibly mean to a society as rich as this? It's political and ideological question. Somebody has it in their goddamn brains that they have to constantly build things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But price is finally relative. It has to be matched again. Well, you know it as well as anybody. Clients have to be creative. Without good clients, you can't do good buildings, right?
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
But all architects can also create good clients out of air.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah, that's.
Yes, no, I agree. Yes, I agree.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Since this is a conversation, I might question Rem about this notion of the client, because this came up already in the beginning of the discussion, talking about the nature of the clients before the Second World War, the Vanderbilts, the Gettys, the Fords, etc. And you were mentioning Bill Gates as a very interesting possible client in contemporary condition. Well, since it's apparently so that even in such a rich country as Holland, the building budget for schools is diminished all the time. You see that even in a situation that there could be very interesting clients, such as Bill Gates, who commissioned a very interesting house for himself, etc. The general situation for the bulk of the building industry is a different situation. Now, we have a completely different situation in capitalism, the organization of capitalism, comparing pre-war situation and today. If we look at these big clients like Ford, Rockefeller, they would be satisfied with 5% profit out of their firms every year, and the rest of the surplus could be spent. It could be spent for architecture. And this is always a kind of impulse for architectural quality. Of the shareholder capitalism, there is a big problem if we take for granted this basic proposition that good architecture needs a good client who knows what he wants, who has a vision to be implemented in space and matter. So there is a big problem. So if we discuss, we did discuss this topic in very general market terms or terms of capitalism, I think we could discuss this. What can we expect from a client which isn't a client anymore as a person, but as an anonymous group? And you consider the contemporary situation as, in a certain way, productive, in a productive manner. So maybe you can link this.
I think that the kind of tricky thing here, for me, is the kind of insistence that architecture has an immutable core, and that only one kind of architectural activity is architecture with a capital A, namely one that is kind of very highly kind of refined, that is about certain and that there is there is no necessary connection between architecture and need, because I think that the reason everyone is so fully employed here is very clear, because there are simply a number of programs that need accommodation, and therefore it is true that the economical situation is very often kind of very painful, and it is also true that kind of maybe less and less money is kind of being invested, or that shareholders are increasingly Philistine in terms of the kind of additional value of architecture, but that is only if you define the additional value of architecture as beauty or as luxury or as something that is kind of separate from the kind of inherent and essential kind of need for the building. And I think that was in a way the the beautiful ingenuity of modern architecture, that it's a declared need to be equal to beauty.
You know, yes.
Kind of shocked that nobody's aware that Bill Gates just commissioned a $120 million R&D center in Cambridge,
England.
University.
We all know. Yeah. I mean,
So what's the question? What's the potential of Bill Gates is the same?
I think he was actually saying that the potential was already declared because he had commissioned a house, a campus, and the faculty is another thing. Yeah?
Does the situation, the economic situation of Asia, the present one, affect your view of this region? And I said that because maybe when you ask Ken to try to define something which could be specific to Dutch tradition, maybe it's a capability or capacity to build a democracy, which means, in short, which means education and so on. Because now it seems that the apparent rightness of this Asian situation is very fragile. And many critics, I mean not architecture, but economists, point the fact that the inability to build democracy is also the case of this fragility. So what is the situation? Does it affect you, or will you go on like this? So that is my first question. Second question, one is the copyright concept, or I didn't understand it wrongly. I read something like a copyrighted concept. Maybe I was wrong.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
I think that I wanted to kind of avoid basically a very simple question answer. The Asian situation affects me exactly as somebody of the public who reads the newspaper, and obviously it will have an enormous impact. But I'm not kind of. I'm like everybody else. I mean, what do you expect? But the copyrighted issue is nothing neither here nor there, I think. But if there's kind of still a question or a comment about the role of Kenneth Frampton as a critic, or the role of his books in contemporary architectural culture, or the role of books in contemporary architecture in general, I would like to hear it, and if not, I would like to kind of declare the meeting is ended.
Yeah, maybe a small one.
Yeah.
Can we live in a future, in a foreseeable future? How the debate's going to go on? You know? Are we going to fragment it more and more? Or could you predict the kind of possibility where the debate or such meetings will come to more kind of, sound or perhaps homogeneous sort of, environment? Or you are really pessimistic?
I'm kind of, I have to say, I'm a sort of little shocked about the way in which my whole production is read as pessimistic. I mean, it just shows you how you can deceive yourself, completely. I sort of don't think of my production as pessimistic. I mean, I think constantly trying to determine limits in order to do work of quality is what architects should do and critics should do. I mean, in terms of like the difference when we've talked a lot about critical regionalism, it seems between say Rem and myself over that very single issue, perhaps is something that would not have the same form 2 or 3 or 4 years from now if one is still around 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. I mean, as you know, I have this interest in megaform, for example, and it seems to me that megaform has some kind of anyway distant connection to the idea of bigness. So maybe here in terms of the way in which Rem formulates his discourse and the way in which I formulate mine, there are some points of convergence which you could say are more indicative, let's say, of what kind of strategies or developments could be pursued in the future, you know. But I was thinking on this question of modernity, you know, and the, I mean, it is interesting that, you know, I mean, I suppose when I first started teaching in the United States, for example, and I mean, I was still, you know, kind of, and perhaps I still am, for that matter, a kind of high modernist kid who was convinced about the sort of manifest destiny of the modern movement, etc. You know, and I clearly I'm not so convinced about it. But on the other hand, you know, I mean, one of the kind of I think very disturbing things is, for example, let's take, you know, very wealthy people, particularly again, of course, the United States, but it could be elsewhere. You know, if you look at what is produced by the American real estate industry and occupied by extremely wealthy people, you know, you say to yourself, wait a minute, I mean, these people and this industry could afford to build for them real modern luxury, you know, that, I mean, I think that in Rem's work, and I think it's this thing that I like in Rem's work, is this kind of address to hedonism, for example, and to the hedonistic aspect of the modern movement that still remains in the work, you know. But if you say, is the real estate industry, developers, building apartments for the super rich, which are really hedonistic modern apartments, you have to say, I'm sorry, they're not. Because, and why is that? Big question mark. I can't, you know, what does that mean? You know, that these people could buy anything. But, you know, other than, you know, jacuzzi and a walk-in closet and a larger living room than the next man, they have no idea about, you know, what would be luxury, you know, no idea whatsoever. And the real estate industry and the developers together are determined not to let them have any idea about what is luxury, you know. And I'm reminded of Grigotti, years and years ago, an essay on kitsch, you know, in Gino D'Offoli's anthology of kitsch, where he shows this aerial photograph and he has the words, the slums of the rich pile up outside Rome, you know. But, you know, the slums of the rich Italian style is probably more luxurious than the slums of the rich American style. You know. And that failure of the modern project from the point of view of the pleasure of the middle class to have modern work, you know, which I think is not so true here and wasn't so true in California, you know, wasn't so true when the Czech state was created, you know, up until the Second World War. And is not true today in Finland either, I think, you know, or less true, let's say, you know, where there is, you know, a middle-class society that has a desire to live a modern life, you know. But what is happening...
But that is also extremely homogeneous.
Yes,
I mean,
but, you know, but how do you...
And therefore...
Yes, but how do you explain, you know, the total loss of confidence of the upwardly mobile American society, who basically, you know, wants to, you know, Calvin Klein and Victoria's Secret and you know, Celebration and Robert Stern and Jacqueline Robinson. That's their idea of making it, you know. I mean, it's a rather sad story. These people are pulling down a fortune, but what do they do with it? You know, that is a disappointing... How does one explain those things about, you know, how a middle class is formed and how it does or does not become, you know, a cultural patron? I think is a... I don't have the equipment to analyze it.
Okay, can we end with this comment?
Yes, by all means. Let's have a drink.
Thank you very much.
Okay.